So I'm Ben, it's my RDO, and I am at Murderers Hill, just near Dunolly. Not an official name, but if you've driven past here, you might have seen this place and wondered what it was all about. So we're going to tell you, but the story isn't here. This road is actually not really connected. The truth is up over the back here, so we'll go find out. So I'm at the back of Murderers Hill in one of the gullies here, and on the 29th of November 1857, a man named William Dean was travelling between the Dunolly goldfields and heading to the Jones's Creek goldfield that way. We now know Jones's Creek as Wayara. He was scratching through some of the old pits and holes in here, and he saw one that had a whole bunch of flies around it. He went over and had a closer look, and it was approximately 8 foot by 4 foot, and it was full of water. And he had a closer look and he saw that actually there was like a rug in there and it had been covered with branches and bits and pieces. So he got a stick and he poked around in there and he saw a boot. He thought that was a bit odd, and he poked a little bit more and he realised the boot was attached to a human and that there was a body in there. So without touching anything else, he got up, he went back to Dunolly to the police camp there, because Dunolly was a relatively new town and it was still a government camp, and he raised the alarm. A Constable McCormick came back to the site with him. They took back some of the branches, pulled back this opossum rug that was covering them, which I think is a possum skin rug, and found there were actually 2 bodies there, one on top of another. They were in a fairly advanced state of decomposition. They'd obviously been there a little while, but it was still quite apparent that they had been killed. So they both had significant head trauma. Apart from the fact that 2 people don't spontaneously die, put themselves in a hole and then cover themselves with blankets. But it was quite obvious they'd been killed horribly. And went back into Dunolly and organised for the bodies to recover the next day and brought into town. You little fella. The bodies were taken back to Dunolly and an inquest was held. They were examined by Dr. Quinlan at the Old House and Home, which was a hotel that pre-existed Dunolly. The upper body was European, 6 foot tall and about 35 years of age. Black hair and whiskers, good muscular development. Dr. Lewis Quinlan explained the victim had a hole in the lower back of his skull from something like the flat end of a driving pick. Quinlan believed there had been a struggle and the verdict was to be murdered by some person or persons unknown. The second man, also European, 5 foot 10 inches in height and about 40 years of age. Sharp features, rather reddish whiskers, a thick beard and moustache. Quinlan explained that he had a hole in the left side of his skull caused by something like the point of a pick. A cap was found with a matching hole. Verdict: murdered by some person or persons unknown. Judging by the amount of decomposition, the bodies had been there for approximately a month, was the estimation at the time. Description was shared with the local newspapers to help with identification because both the men were unknown and there was no one really reported missing. You have to remember in this age and time, though, it wouldn't be unusual for someone to go away working and not be heard from weeks at a time. The Maryborough Advertiser ran the story on December 4th, 1857. It was read by Mary Dunlop at Jones's Creek. She realised the shorter man was her husband, Richard Dunlop, and she went to authorities. On December 10th, 1857, William Dean, the man who found the bodies, was charged with the murders and remanded for a week. It seems to be that they were really clutching at straws at this point. They did find that 2 picks and a pair of moleskin trousers at Dean's tent. One of them had marks of blood upon it. I mean, he was a miner, he would have picks. He remembered that he'd got some blood on them at the butcher's. When the butcher corroborated the story, he was let free. Thursday, January 7th, 1858, the next year, government sets a reward of £100 for information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the parties who were connected with the murders. At the same time offering a free pardon to any accomplice, not being the actual murderer or one of them, who will turn Queen's evidence. The reward was seen as far too small by most of the papers at the time, although, like now, they probably just like to complain about stuff the government's done. Friday, February the 5th, 4 men, Samuel Dryston, John Anderson, Robert Jones and Thomas Dealing, are arrested and taken to Carisbrook Police Station, where they're remanded for about a week. Eventually released on bail, and if there was evidence against them of any significance, it's been lost to time because nothing further happens with this, and there doesn't seem to be any clear link from them. The trail goes cold for quite some time. December of 1858, a man named Richard Dunbar comes to the Carisbrook police and confesses to taking part in the double murder. He implicated 2 men, Bill Brown and Job Neal, and his ex-partner, Marianne or Polly Dodd, saying he was tricked into committing a crime, believing the 2 men had a large nugget. Polly had been his girl, but she left him after the murders because of their frequent arguing. She had taken up with a man named Job Neal, said he wanted to bring them to justice. The story was believed. Polly was arrested in Dunolly, and she now had a newborn baby. At the time, she was 28. She had 2 children. Job Neal was arrested at Pleasant Creek. So the next bit of this story is really complex, and it's the court case, basically. I wanted to explain it, and really, it's really hard to do without visuals because there's a lot of different stories, there's a lot of different viewpoints, some of it just blatantly contradicts each other, and we've really mostly got newspaper articles from different papers that focus on different things. So I wanted to do a visual recreation as best I could of what happened next because it's quite amazing. Some content creators would have used AI to recreate the Dunolly courthouse. I'm a little opposed to that. I'm going to try and do this the old school way. I'm going to try really hard to not use AI in this channel, but don't worry, because the Benny's audio build team has been working furiously. And look what we've done. A perfect 1 to 25,000 recreation of the Dunolly courthouse on my welding table here. As you see, authentic sign, picture of Queen Victoria, jury box, judge, defence box, public gallery, etc. It's all here. And through this medium, we can explore the amazing story of what actually happened next, because it's good. So, early February, Job Neal finds himself at the Dunolly Police Court. The function of this court seems to be to assess whether the case is strong enough to take to a proper jury for charging. I'm no lawologist, but that seems to be the way it works. Now, Job is charged with the murder of Robert Dunlop only, remembering that Robert was the only man to be identified. Now, he's got some more problems, and not just with the murder charge. It seems that the girl he ran off with, Mary Dunlop, with 3-week-old baby, is about to turn prosecution witness for immunity. There are also 3 new witnesses already to testify that he was in the area of the murder at the time and acting sus. Thomas Irwin, miner at Dunolly lead, lived in a tent very close to the murder scene. His wife, Clara Irwin, run what everyone seemed to be quite open about being a sly grog shop at the site. His sister, Elizabeth, lived in a tent next door and would also testify that Job had been in the area. So Job had one thing going for him. He actually made a lot of money in the last little while in the goldfields. He had a very, very successful claim. He used that money to hire his defence, and he had a lawyer, a Mr. Hoskins, that proved to be money very well spent. Mary Dunlop, widow of Robert, was the first to be sworn into the witness box. She said that 30th October 1857 was the last time she saw her husband, Robert. He was going to the White Hills near Maryborough in the company of Hugh McLean. She knew the clothes she took, and when she went away, she said there was an opossum rug, a blue blanket, a billy, and a pannikin. He wore a cotton cap on his head and said she could identify those things if she was to see him again, particularly the rug and the hat because she'd made them herself. These were produced, and she confirmed they were the ones he had had. She couldn't remember what Hugh was wearing, but thought she'd had some kind of cap, a calico hat. The cap he'd had on him, or the body he'd had on him, was reproduced, and she thought it was probably the same, but not something she could swear to. She talked about McLean being a powerful man of about 40, a Scotsman, tall and strong. Husband was also quite capable. Neither of them, she thought, would give up money easily. She said her husband had a middle finger on the left hand that was distorted. It stood straight and could not be bent. It had been like that for a number of years. At this point, the defence solicitor became aware of and objected to the fact that Dodd and Dunbar were in conversation outside of the court. The bench refused to intervene, though. We hear from a number of people. Floris Lafos, who was a native of Mauritius and a blacksmith who had known both the men, and they had stayed with him at White Hills. We hear the story of the discovery of the bodies, Constable McCormick's deposition about what was happening in the recovery, the doctors in the process of identification, the coronial inquiry, and the story I've already told. The next man in the box was Richard Dunbar. Richard Dunbar said he was living at Jones's Creek at the time in question. He had two claims and he had given one to the prisoner, Job Neal. They were both situated in Paddy's Gully, Burnt Creek. Saw the prisoner again at the Dunolly at the end of October in 1857, possibly on a Saturday. I was at Jones's Creek living. I knew Robert Dunlop and I knew his mate, Hugh McLean. They were both living at Jones's Creek not that far from me. I met the prisoner at the back of the Bull and Moth Hotel in Dunolly. Between there and the road that led to the refreshment tents at the junction towards Jones's Creek. I was on my way home. It was the evening. Mary Ann Dodd and the two children were with me. The prisoner met me and asked how I was getting on. I said bad enough, or words to those effect. Spoke of the diggings getting bad and how bad money was at the time. He asked me if I wanted a chance to make some money, and I said yes. He said there was a party on the road from White Hills who had a good deal of money about them. And I said, I think I'll have nothing to do with it. Mary Ann Dodd, who was present, urged me to take part in it. The prisoner then said, you have nothing to fear. I have the lookout for you two. If there's any fighting to do, I will do it. We walked towards Jones's Creek. As we were walking along, the prisoner whistled something like a call, and a man appeared, who the prisoner said was Bill Brown. The prisoner then said to me, never mind, Dick. Here's a tried hand. We all sat together. There was Job, Bill Brown, myself, Mary Ann Dodd, and the children. The conversation then turned to how we should attack the party. After a while, we divided up in different parties, and I took a lookout for the purpose of attacking the parties from White Hills. Mary Dodd was posted on the Dunolly side. I was next to her on the Jones's Creek side, about 150 yards. Bill and Job were about 100 yards behind me, on the Jones's Creek side. We'd waited a considerable time when Mary Ann Dodd gave a signal. Can't remember what it was. I think it was a cooey. I repeated the signal with my voice. The prisoner and Brown answered it. After this, I heard the sound of footsteps. They came from the Dunolly way. Shortly after hearing the approaching footsteps, I saw the shadow and the outline of two men. These two men passed by me within 6 or 7 yards. They walked towards Jones's Creek. I saw something white on top of both of them, like a cap on each. Did not recognise the men as they passed me. The next I heard a scuffle in the directions of Jones's Creek. It sounded like a good distance off, 50 to 100 yards. Heard a voice of the prisoner, Neal. He said, help, or help me, Dick. I went in the direction of Job Neal's voice. Before I got to him, I was attacked by a powerful arm, by which I was thrown a distance of 4 or 5 yards against a tree. Before I could recover myself, he tackled me again. We were wrestling for some minutes, and then this powerful man, I found he had a mastery of me. I called out, Polly, help, or something of that kind. Mary Dodd came up, took hold of him behind, but before I could get away from the man, the prisoner came up and struck the man who was struggling on top of me with the back or the top of the head. Neal came from the Jones's Creek side. He came broadside of the powerful man and struck him in the head, who then let go of me and fell to the ground. And I said that this was bloody work. The blow was given with a pick or something like that. I said if I'd known this was what was going to happen, I would have not have joined you. Neal was then stooping, feeling the body. He said, never mind, here's the money. But I could not tell him anything. I could not see what was in his hand. And I actually made some kind of vulgar expression instead. Damn your money, I'll have none of your blood money. The man who attacked me was dead on the ground. He never spoke but died without a groan. When Neal held out his hand and said there was money, Brown then said, here was money too. Neal then said to me, what are you going to do now? And this might have been said to the other, but I answered, I will have no more to do with it. At this time, I saw a dark spot in the ground about 7 or 8 yards from me. When I took the body of the other man, Neal shouldered the body of the man whom I'd been wrestling and carried him off down the road to the right-hand side into the gully. I saw Bill Brown carry the other man after Neal in the same direction and went about 10 or 15 yards. I and Mary Ann Dodd stopped on the road. We waited for half an hour to 45 minutes before they returned, and they said, you're a coward, you're not going to split the money with us? And I said, I don't want to, I tell you. They said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going on. And I left with Mary Ann Dodd and the children, and we went home to Jones's Creek. Neil and Brown went off in the direction of Dunolly.
So if this story's getting a little bit confusing, basically Dunbar was saying he, Marianne Dodd, the two kids were in Dunolly. They sold some gold and they were heading back to their home at Jones's Creek, right? They were taking the back road. On the edge of Dunolly, they met Job Neal, who apparently comes to them and makes a proposal after a bit of chit-chat. And they planned to rob someone, basically who was going to come through on this road with a fair bit of cash, is the rumour, or maybe some gold, but with something worth robbing. So they head on down the path a bit and they get to a point and Neil Job whistles. Job Neal whistles. And out of the bush wanders this man who is introduced as Bill Brown. Man of mystery and apparently a bit of a thug and quite capable of taking on some robbery. They sit down for a while and they plan their robbery, and they represent it as being fairly reluctant to participate, but they decide they're going to go ahead and do it. They're probably in need of money. Their job is to stake watch. So Marianne Dodd, with the two kids, takes a spot on the side of the path, the side. Her job is to call out when they come past. Dunbar is a little further down the track, and he's got the same job. His job's also to call out when they go past. So Marianne waits a while. She sees the two men go past. She describes just being a few meters away from them. And she gives a cooey or something. It's replied back from Dunbar, who then calls out again. Then there's a bit of silence. Dunbar says he hears the kerfuffle down the road and hears Job calling for help. And so he goes to help him and he runs down the track and he gets a little way and then suddenly he's pushed over by a really strong man, pushed up against the tree, and he gets into a fight with him. And he's struggling with him, and this guy's really quite strong and he's starting to lose and he's really having some difficulty. And he calls out to Polly, Marianne Dodd as we know her, who comes and helps, and she runs up, grabs the man by the collar and tries to pull him off, but she can't because she's not strong enough either. They're wrestling and she's trying to pull him off her. He's underneath. He says in court that possibly he was going to get killed here because that's how he felt. Job Neal's come across and smashed the guy in the side of the head with what sounds like was a pick, and he's killed. Marianne Dodd basically tells the same story from her perspective too. And you can't help feeling that maybe this bit of the story is quite genuine. I'm not really convinced about the whole wait for them to come past and call out, because if you're going to ambush a couple of people, wouldn't you just sit on the side of the track and wait for them without doing cooeys? If I'm walking down a lonely bush track like this one, maybe it was this one, and I've got a billy full of gold and I'm taking the back route because maybe I'm a little suspicious of what might be going on, I hear people cooing all around me in the bush, I'm going to find the biggest, most dangerous thing I can and have it in my hand, or I'm going to disappear out this way and you're not going to find me. Just because a plan's stupid, though, doesn't mean they didn't go with it too, so who knows?
Dunbar was cross-examined. Yes, I was speaking to Marianne Dodd today outside. She asked me to take care of a child. I lived with her for 4.5 years and some months before I turned witness. She's not my wife. I've been in the habit of brutally ill-treating the woman for a few weeks before I turned witness. I did not threaten to murder her. I said I had a suspicion that she had murdered her child. I had no benefit from the murder of these two men. I did not take any money from them. I had an idea that Polly, that is, Marianne Dodd, would make a witness in the prosecution, and I asked her whether she would confess. It's likely Job Neal rescued me from a violent death. The man I was fighting was very strong. Marianne Dodd had run away with the witness to Pleasant Creek. She was afraid of me. I'd been violent. I sent a sovereign to Mary Dunlop via Marianne Dodd after seeing the account of the murder in the Advertiser. Thomas King Irwin was sworn in. I'm a digger. I remember the end of October 1857. I was living on Jones's Creek Road. My wife kept a refreshment tent and I was digging. Might be a mile or a mile and a half from Dunolly. I was living on the side of the junction on the old Jones's Creek Road near Ford and Garland's store. I know the prisoner. I have seen him before. I saw him at the later end of October in my tent. In the night. I cannot say what hour. It was between 9 and 11 o'clock. I never knew the prisoner before. There was another man with him. He came into my tent and asked for the road to Burnt Creek or Old Dunolly. I'm not sure which. It was dark. It was very dark. They came and entered into conversation. Did not know the names of either of the men, and the only names they used on the night to each other were Ike for one and Bill the other. The prisoner assumed or went by the name of Ike, and the other man by the name of Bill. They might have remained an hour or 2 hours. I am certain they did not exceed the later time. They had several bottles of ale or porter, and I was there the whole time they remained. I was in conversation with them. The reason why I remember the conversation is that the prisoner asked me if I wished to buy a horse for £25. This made me take particular notice of the prisoner. The prisoner asked me the road to Ararat. He didn't want to touch the government road and wanted to avoid the police camp. They wished to go, and the other man by the name of Bill wished me to go with them and show them the road to Dunolly or Burnt Creek, which I refused as the night was dark. I gave each a candle inside a broken bottle. I've never seen the prisoner since, until I was brought to the camp. I described him to the constable before I saw him, a particular scar under his right eye. Identified him after. The prisoner is the same man. Mr. Hoskin rose to object. When a discussion ensued, the bench ruled against Mr. Hoskin, who still persisted. The bench, sit down, Mr. Hoskin, sit down. I insist upon it. If this conduct goes on, I shall refuse to hear you at all. Examination continued. I see the scar. You have to look close at him before you can see it, but I was sitting close to him in the evening. I came from Blackpool to Port Phillip 6 years ago. I kept a tent, a refreshment tent. Yes, a sly grog tent or a shanty if you like. I'm quite sure beyond any earthly doubt that this prisoner is the man. Mr. Hoskins, I won't let you escape if I can help it. On the bench, Mr. Hoskins, you are not justified in using such an expression to the witness. You have no right to attempt to intimidate him. Mr. Hoskins, your worship must bear in mind that I do not believe the statement of the witness. 2 other men will someday be brought before this court who really committed the murder. I pledge myself to the worship that I declare before God I believe the prisoner innocent. There was a few more questions. Then Mr. Hoskin to the witness. So the inquest took place on November 30. Now tell me directly, did you not hear of the murder? I heard of 2 bodies. Yes, you've never heard of the murder unless you were there. I did not come here to be insulted. To whom did you give the information that led to you being called as a witness? The police came to me. The police can find anybody out. It would puzzle a Philadelphia lawyer to find you out. I object to that assertion. Sergeant Downing came to me and asked if I could identify the man. He came to me while at work and related the circumstances. Downing knew them by report. There are a few more questions. Then Mr. Hosking asked about the other man, Bill. Was there any mark about the other man? Mr. Fernell, the prosecution attorney, objected, and about the first time we've heard from him. The other man is not before the court. Here ensued another argument. This case is an important one. The other man said at large the ends of justice might be frustrated by pursuing the course of Mr. Hoskins' examination. The bench considered for a while and decided in favour of Mr. Hoskins asking the question. Cross-examination continued. I could tell him by his general appearance and stature. He was a dark man. I should know him if I saw him again. He was a man from 5'7" to 5'9" high. His face was rather round. He was stouter than the prisoner. He was quick of speech and had the mark about his wrist, as if the bone had been broken or injured. I could identify him. The description was given in such quick succession it was clearly a pre-prepared statement. After the entire interrogation at this point had been so vague, it was such a stark contrast, the public gallery broke out into a round of applause and cheering. It went on for a bit. He admitted to seeing Job the next morning in new clothes, no sign of Brown this time. Clara Irwin was the next witness. She was Jewish, so she was sworn in on the Old Testament only. It wasn't going to help. She swore to basically the same story, that 2 had come to the tent in the night. They had a bit to drink, stayed for 1 to 2 hours, and left after trying to find directions to avoid the police down the road, and sounding suspicious as they probably could be painted. She added a little bit about having a bundle of stuff that Job had left behind to pick up the next day that included a large club-like stick. Her sister Elizabeth would also be sworn in. Elizabeth lived in the tent next door to the Sly Grog tent that the Irwins were keeping. She would have a similar testimony, although didn't seem to spend as much time in the tent in her story. Both Clara and Elizabeth saw Job the next day in brand new shiny clothes. Clara's testimony and cross-examination was quite trivial and jovial. She didn't seem at all intimidated by the court. She would exchange banter with the lawyers and seemed to really be playing up on the crowd attention. At one point, pointing out the police sergeant had asked her on a date to the theatre because he fancied her, apparently. Marianne Dodd is finally sworn in. Mr. Hoskins is into her straight away, asking the witness be made to stand. Normally, women would be allowed to sit when giving evidence. The bench asked why, and Fennell objected. We don't actually hear whether she was overruled, but Hoskins' argument was that she was a murderer by her own showing. To Fennell, the prosecutor, I am a married woman. I do not know where my husband is. I remember the Christmas of 1857. I was living at the later end at Jones's Creek. I have one child at Jones's Creek. Mr. Hoskins interrupted and asked her to speak up. She said, I am not afraid to speak. I know you're not afraid. The bench interjected, Mr. Hoskins, we will not permit the witness to be bullied. She would essentially give the same story. They'd been travelling back with Dunbar and the two children from Dunolly towards Jones's Creek. They've run into Job, who's made an offer to help ambush some people who they knew were going to travel through with a bit of money. They were both positioned at different places to give warning when the party were advancing and weren't supposed to have any more involvement in the crime, apparently, than this. They'd waited some time in the darkness, and when the men had passed, she'd called out a signal that had been replied. Waited a little while, and there was a kerfuffle down the road that was beyond her sight. But she heard Dunbar calling for help, and she'd gone to assist. Dunbar was wrestling a strong, powerful man who she tried to pull off, but she wasn't strong enough. Job Neal had then come over and given him a blow on the head with something that was apparently a pick, or may have been a pick. Mr. Hoskins had been assisted by another attorney, Mr. McDermott, and there'd been a bit of kerfuffle at the start about who was actually going to run the case. At this point, McDermott went up to cross-examine, and there was an argument between Hoskins and McDermott about who should actually do the cross-examination. McDermott saying he hadn't had a chance to do anything all day. Job was actually asked which one he wanted representing him, and he chose McDermott at this point. Hoskins wandered out of the court, only to wander back in halfway through the cross-examination and object to one of McDermott's questions. The bench almost exploded, saying they'd literally never seen in their careers someone on the same side objecting to a question in a cross-examination. This was the end of the witnesses. Hoskins summed up and addressed the bench in a great long speech. He questioned the motives. He wondered about Dunbar being connected to the murder. He speculated about the honesty of the Irwin's statements. He said that Dr. Pearce's evidence was quite reliable from the medical examination, but Dr. Quinlan could not tell a stiff finger from an ossified elbow. He felt Mrs. Dunlop may have been the only honest witness that had spoken to the court in the proceedings. He said some of the others should probably result in trials for perjury. He said if he had some time to get evidence together, he could prove that his client had been in Adelaide from May to November, hundreds of kilometres away. There was some debate about it, but the bench decided there was enough evidence to send this to the Supreme Court in Castlemaine. They did, however, agree to delay for one cycle of court sessions, basically, to allow Hoskins time to get some evidence and witnesses together to prove that his client may or may not have been out of the colony. Okay, so let's summarise, because there's an awful lot going on, and it's a bit overwhelming, to be honest. And when you read it through separate accounts, it's even worse. So I'm trying to draw it all together for you to make it simple. Job Neal has been accused of the murder. Well, essentially, it's assumed he did both murders. He's been charged with one murder because only one of the men could be positively identified. End of the day, you can't hang someone twice, so you only need to charge them successfully with one. The evidence is shaky. Dunbar seems to be the primary driver for it. Later on, Mary Ann's jumped in and said a very, very similar story to Dunbar, but basically said that he was asked by Job to be an accomplice in a robbery. Very, very conveniently, it seems they were on the periphery. You know, they had to signal and call out bird calls and let them know that people were coming, which all sounds a bit fanciful. You're going to tell me two hardened criminals wanted them to come in and basically not participate in the robbery, but still get a share of the takings? It doesn't seem very likely, but, you know, it's a story. And I feel in all the rubbish, all the nonsense of that story, there's probably an element of truth in there. The Irwins have come forward and provided evidence, and it's not really clear what their story is, but it's a pretty shaky story as well. So, however, the court's deemed there's enough evidence for this to go on to a proper trial.
And the next chapter of this happens at the Supreme Court in Castlemaine in a few months' time. Hoskins has jumped on his horse to try and get to South Australia to actually find some evidence that his client wasn't in the area at the time. So let's see what happens. And the other thing, the question you might be asking yourself is, where's Brown? Bill Brown, this man who can magically appear out of the bush and the hardened criminal who was the co-conspirator with Job. Well, there's no sign of him. Police can't find him anywhere. No one really knows anything about him. The only person that seems to be linked with him is Job, which is really odd. So, Friday, the 1st of July, court case starts in Castlemaine. And as an ominous sign for the prosecution, Job Neal's lawyer actually has a pastoralist from South Australia who he says is ready to testify that his client was not even in the colony at the time he was accused of this murder. The case started much the same way as the Dunolly Police Court. Mary Dunlop came up and talked about her husband and McLean and gave the background and pretty much the same information she did the first time. A lot of time was put into the medical examination. It was revealed that Robert Dunlop's body was exhumed for a third time and the hand examined yet again, and there was some debate again about the identity, but it was generally accepted. Thomas Irwin's sworn in, and he gives very similar testimony to last time. The cross-examination gets a little bit interesting. He's pushed really hard to try and recall what the two had been talking about while they're in the tent. After all, they'd been there for an hour and a half, almost 2 hours potentially. And he tells a story about looking for a route to Ararat and avoiding the government camp and the road. But when pushed, Thomas starts to say, I didn't really understand what they were talking about. It's like they were in a foreign language, or maybe it was slang, and I really couldn't understand it. And he gets more and more evasive, and he gets pushed harder and harder. At one point, Dawson, who's doing the cross-examination, goes, do you really know the meaning of a nobbler? Yet you don't know what this slang or foreign language the prisoner and the man you was called Bill just now? Come on, tell us that they spoke about this foreign language. What was it? The witness was pressed very hard to state words. He shuffled about. He appeared perplexed. He started to perspire and sweat drops in his head and couldn't really answer the questions, became very uncomfortable. When he left the dock, the judge directed that Mr. Irwin was not to be permitted to leave the court. Clara Irwin was next in the witness stand. This time she told the same story, but it was elaborated a little more. She said that after a while they were concerned the two men were going to hold them up. So her husband had gone to a bedroom and got a revolver and put it in his belt and said to him, I think those men want to put us up. She also mentioned more about the bundle which was tied up in the red handkerchief and the stick that it had with him. So when they're going to leave, she called their attention to them and said, it's of no consequence, and they called for in the morning. But the stick, she now added that she said, I should not like to get a blow from that stick. Almost a little bit too elaborate. The cross-examination, they seized on the revolver. The revolver was under the pillow. It's kept there to protect us in a lonely place. From being murdered, eh? From worse than being murdered. Am I to understand that revolver is kept to preserve your virtue? There's laughter from the public gallery. My virtue has nothing to do with the matter, sir. What is a revolver kept for then, madam? To murder people? Why, what are firearms always kept for? To preserve persons' lives. I did keep a refreshment tent, but I do not now. I haven't kept one since the incident. Since what, madam? Since the murder? You know nothing about it, I suppose? No, I came here to speak the truth. Do you swear, madam, that you do not know about the murder that I refer to? Well, yes, but you asked the question, so funny. Funny, is it? Tell your husband where the bodies were found? I do not know. What do you mean, you did not ask? After the cross-examination, the judge directed that Mrs. Irwin was also not to leave the court. Elizabeth Bowen's testimony was much the same as the time before. Things really didn't get interesting until Richard Dunbar took to the stand. He started his testimony. I was a miner at the end of 1856. I was residing in Dunolly, mining. I knew the prisoner at the bar. I met him a couple of times and I worked with him. I made an offer of a claim to him that turned out bad. I was residing at Jones's Creek the whole of 1857 and never saw the prisoner. Mr. Armstrong, the prosecutor. Do you mean, sir, to swear, sir, that in October of 1857 you did not see the prisoner at the bar? If I be allowed to make a statement, I can clear up the mystery. Mr. Armstrong. No, I want you to answer the question. Did you not see the prisoner in 1857? Yes, well, that is no. I was mistaken. I did not see him. I know Mary Dodd. She was living with me. I knew Dunlop, the deceased. I saw him about a month before the murder and never since. I saw Hugh McLean the same time and never since.
I was examined on this case before. My evidence was taken down and read to me. I swore to it under a vindictive feeling at the time. If you allow me to speak, I can clear up the mystery. No, answer my question. At the end of October 1857, were you not in the company of Mary Dodd on the Joneses Creek Road? Yes, I was also with Bill Brown coming from Dunolly. I had some conversation with him. The prisoner at the bar was not there then. I tell you again, I can clear up the mystery, if this affair, if you will allow me. Mr. Armstrong refused to allow him to speak, read his evidence from his statement instead, where he goes through the whole story that we'd heard about the ambush along the road towards Joneses Creek. Dunbar interjected at one point and said, where I was talking about Job Neal, that was actually Bill Brown. It wasn't Job Neal at all. I was just thinking of him. I got a bit confused. After the statement was read out, at the suggestion of Mr. Dawson, Dunbar was allowed to finally make his statement. And he said his previous statements respecting the prisoner had been influenced by vindictive motives. Because Neal had dishonoured his home, he'd made him miserable and disgraced his child. And when Mary Dodd had run away, it had really upset him. So on account of this, at the present time, he'd said what he'd said about the case. He hoped the prisoner was sorry for what he'd done, and he was sorry for what he'd done to the prisoner. It hoped to be a lesson for him in the future. Dunbar then got up, left the box to the astonishment of the audience, who were most amazed above everything else that he had the air of an injured man and to be the victim of this and not someone who just committed terrible perjury. The judge ordered that Dunbar was not to leave the court as well. Mary Ann Dodd followed next and must have been quite surprised at the situation she was in. She had a young child in her arms now. She said she was residing at the Joneses Creek at the end of 1857. She knew the prisoner at the bar and basically said now that she'd never seen him, or Bill Brown. She hadn't been involved in the process at all. There was a quick conversation between the prosecution and the defence at the bar, and the decision was made that there was basically no case to proceed from here. The jury was directed to find a non-guilty verdict against Job Neal, and the case was dismissed.
So what happened somewhere back here near Dunolly? What happened on this quiet road back here? We don't really know. In the end, no one else was charged. No one else was even investigated from the crime as far as we can tell. The two murders were unresolved. I can't help feeling, though, we got an element of truth in the story that Dunbar and Mary Ann Dodd told. It's clear that basically Job Neal wasn't involved and he was somewhere else, and he seems to have been a convenient excuse or a convenient target to frame for the picture. What was the Irwins deal? How were they involved in this? We don't really know, but I do speculate that maybe if you took the name Bill Brown and replaced it with Thomas Irwin, suddenly the Irwins have a motive to frame someone else for this murder. You can't tell me they wanted to commit perjury and maybe go to jail, risk going to jail, over the reward money or just as a favour. Doesn't really make any sense, does it? Mary Ann Dodd and Dunbar were clearly involved in this, but how is not clear. It seems ludicrous that they'd be asked to participate in a robbery for a share of it, and their only job was to not be involved in the violence and the actual robbery, but just to hide off to the side and warn them that the people were coming. It doesn't make any sense, does it? You wouldn't split the money for that. You would just take the money. What if Mary Ann Dodd and Dunbar actually organised the robbery? They knew the victims. They lived down the road from them. Maybe they'd run into them in Dunolly and they knew they were going to head out of town and they had a bit of money on them or a bit of gold on them. And they didn't want to be seen, so they've waited off to the side until things actually got out of hand and they've had to jump in themselves. What if they set them up? Hey, I think too many people might know about this. There's trouble on the main road. I would sneak down the back road, maybe wait till darkness. Would make more sense, wouldn't it? The other possibility I wonder about is maybe these miners were travelling along late. Maybe they weren't trying to avoid anything. Maybe they were just scratching through the old diggings here, seeing what they can find, much like William Dean was doing later on when he found the bodies. Maybe they stopped at the refreshment tent. Maybe they wanted a drink. Maybe they paid for that drink with a bit of gold or gave some hint about how much money they were carrying. And maybe that's what got them killed. Anyway, speculation. Reality is we're just never going to know. So in the end, I think Bill Brown never actually existed. He suffered a total existence failure, which is quite unfortunate. I think his main reason for being there was to explain how Job Neal could overpower two strong men on his own. reality is he didn't. He was helped, whether it was Dunbar, Thomas Irwin, or someone else, we don't really know. But they were involved in it, there's no doubt. The murder goes unresolved. These people go on to live their lives. But if you've ever had any doubt about Dunbar's capability to commit violence, then consider this story. The Irwins, Marianne Dodd, Richard Dunbar are all charged with perjury. They are held in Castlemaine, and the trials go through a whole lengthy process. There's a whole nother story around those that I won't recreate for you because you probably had enough minifigures and cardboard. All of those charges end up failing. All of them get off, but not before another incident. Marianne Dodd had her young child and was walking around the prison yard at Castlemaine. Richard Dunbar asked if he could go and kiss his child coming past. And he'd done this a number of times before, and he was shackled and he had 2 guards with him, so they figured it was okay. And basically he wandered up to her, went forward as if to kiss her baby, then put his hands behind her head and pulled her in towards him. And he bit her on the nose, and he bit the end of her nose clean off. They think he swallowed it because they couldn't find it afterwards. So this is a man who was capable of violence. Finally, someone actually gets sentenced for something, and Dunbar does 3 years with hard labour. The only person from any of this who ended up spending some jail time, apart from those who were detained waiting for court. Anyway, there you go. That's the history of Murderers Hill.
So special thanks goes to the Dunolly Historical Society, who have a website that has a lot of the resources and information about this story, and I used it heavily in putting this video together. They've also done a bit of work on trying to locate the original site of the incident of the murder, and they believe they've actually found it in the bush. So there's a video, I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in seeing that one. I did some other research too, but their page was very, very useful. So thanks to them.